Hi there, I'm Mrs F, and this is my video on the economic and political crisis which took place in Germany between 1929 and 1932. Although I'm following the Edexcel specification, you'll find that a lot of the content is also relevant to other exam boards. In my previous two lessons, I looked at the Munich Putsch and the lean years from 1923 to 29. In the next two lessons, we'll look at the reasons for the growth in Nazi support. In today's lesson, it's looking at economic and political reasons, and next lesson, I'll be having a look at the things which the Nazi Party themselves did. So in my previous lesson, I was talking about how support for the Nazi Party was really low during the so-called golden age of the Weimar Republic. So why did things change so suddenly? Well, first of all, confidence began to ebb away on the 3rd of October 1929, when Stresemann had a heart attack and died. The loss of his expertise was a severe blow to the Weimar Republic. What's really interesting is just before his death in September, when he was speaking to the League of Nations, he actually warned that the economic position of Germany was only flourishing on the surface. He said that Germany was in fact dancing on a volcano, and that if the short-term loans were called in by America, under the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, then a large section of the economy would collapse. And this is exactly what happened. Later in October, the Wall Street crash occurred. In October 1929, share prices had begun to fall on the Wall Street Stock Exchange. Now, because these share prices were falling, people started to worry about losing money, so they rushed to sell their shares before they fell further. And in this panic, something called Black Thursday on the 24th of October occurred, when panic selling sent prices even lower. Shares worth $20,000 in the morning were only worth $1,000 by the end of the day's trading. And within a week, investors had lost a whopping $4,000 million. The Wall Street crash triggered a world economic crisis known as the Great Depression, and in Germany this caused economic collapse, massive unemployment and political crisis. Now I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not a huge fan of economic history, so I've tried to make this as simple to understand as possible. I'm going to begin by looking at the immediate impact of the Wall Street crash. Now, German banks were big investors in shares on the US stock exchange. So when the Wall Street crash occurred, they suffered massive losses. What happened next was something called a run on the banks. Think of that quite literally, people rushing to the banks to withdraw their money because they're scared that the banks might go bust and they won't be able to access their savings. Now, this caused the banks to run out of money because everyone's trying to withdraw it at once, like you can see in that image. So, because the German banks needed cash very urgently to pay all these people who were trying to withdraw their savings, they then had to go to businesses that they'd loaned money to and demanded that they pay back the loans immediately. Now, because German industries were deprived of bank loans, this meant that they had to cut back on their production of goods or close completely, and this caused the economy to collapse. And all of this led to a vicious downward cycle. Because of the loss of bank loans and the need to cut back production, German industries and farms began to lay off workers. And since the economic crisis was worldwide, not just happening in Germany, it meant that companies were not able to sell as many goods abroad. So then they made even more workers unemployed. Now, the unemployed were only getting quite a low amount of unemployment insurance. They couldn't afford to spend as much. They could really only afford to buy the essentials and not manufactured goods. And as sales fell further, it meant that even more workers had to be made unemployed. And this just kept repeating itself, leading to mass unemployment and an economic depression. The Great Depression had a huge impact on the German people. Unemployment absolutely skyrocketed. And by January 1933, which is when Hitler came to power, 1 in 3 Germans were unemployed, and the figure had hit 6.1 million. This included 40% of all factory workers, 50% of all Germans between the age of 16 and 30, and 60% of university graduates. So lots of different people were suffering. And as the number of people out of work grew, the government really struggled to pay unemployment benefits. They had to put up taxes, and unemployment benefits were cut, which caused even bigger problems for the unemployed. Some people had issues with their savings because they had had their savings invested in shares. When share prices crashed in 1929, the value of their savings crashed too, which meant that if they became unemployed, they had no savings to fall back on. And this was only 6 years after hyperinflation had wiped out people's savings, so it must have been really gutting. People who were lucky enough to have a job suffered too. As I've already mentioned, their taxes went up to help pay for unemployment benefits for other people. But worse still, because people were so desperate for work, it gave employers an excuse to cut wages. Real wages in 1932 were 70% of 1928 levels. So basically, you weren't able to afford to buy as much with your money. There was also a huge rise in homelessness. People simply couldn't afford their rent. So shanty towns of makeshift houses began to spring up, and unemployed people wandered the streets looking for work and food. Boredom often turned to violence, so fights would break out in the streets between police and roaming bands of young men. There was an increase of 24% in arrests for theft in Berlin. It was quite clear that the German people were desperate. Now, of course, what you really need in an economic crisis is strong government. But this just didn't happen. In March 1930, the Chancellor, Hermann Müller, who was a Social Democrat, resigned, and he was replaced by Heinrich Brüning, who was leader of the Centre Party. Now, Brüning proposed having higher taxes to pay for unemployment benefits. And he also proposed a fixed time limit on unemployment benefits in order to make payments more affordable. But unfortunately, this alienated absolutely everybody. The right-wing parties and the more wealthy people were opposed to paying higher taxes. Now, the left-wing parties and the working classes were unhappy about reduced benefits. So in July 1930, Brüning's policies were rejected by 256 votes to 193. Now, because the moderate parties failed to work together, it made the Reichstag powerless to make policy. Whereas the Reichstag had met 94 times in 1930, it met only 41 times in 1931 and only 13 times in 1932. And this is because, with Brüning being unable to get laws passed in the Reichstag, he used Article 48 in the Constitution to ask President Hindenburg to pass emergency laws on his behalf. Now, in 1930, there had only been 5 presidential decrees. But as the crisis deepened, Brüning's government had to rely on 44 decrees in 1931 and 66 in 1932. All of this undermined democracy and weakened the power of the Reichstag, which many historians have said helped pave the way for Hitler's dictatorship. With Brüning having lost control of the Reichstag, he resigned in May 1932. Now, because the moderate parties had failed to solve Germany's problems, voters began switching to the extremist parties at either end of the political spectrum because they offered simple solutions to Germany's problems. Now, whereas 10% of voters supported the communists in the elections of 1928, this went up to 15% of voters by 1932, which was about 1 million extra voters. And by 1932, the German Communist Party was the largest communist party in the world outside of the Soviet Union. Now, support for the communists was particularly strong amongst the working classes in the large towns, first of all because of growing unemployment, and secondly because of falling wages. Many people in the working classes saw the communists as the only party who would defend their jobs and their wages against employers and landowners. But as you can see from that table at the bottom of the screen, you can see that support for the Nazi Party grew way faster than support for the communists. And this is because the idea of a communist government absolutely petrified the middle and upper classes. They were worried that if a communist government came to power, they might have their land and businesses confiscated by the state. And as communist support grew, the middle and upper classes became even more likely to vote for the Nazis because they saw Hitler as their best defence against the communists. And fear of communism was a very powerful factor in the Nazis' rise to power. So now that we've looked at the economic and political reasons for the Nazi rise to power, next time we're going to focus in on the strengths of the Nazi Party themselves, the appeal of Hitler, the effects of propaganda, and the work of the SA. So hopefully I'll catch you next week for my next video. Goodbye.